So my pleasure now in a different room to introduce one of our in-person speakers. You've already met him in a way because I quoted him yesterday.
Okay.
And because we're short of time, I'm not going to say very much more because he has a lot to say himself. And I'm really looking forward to hearing it. So over to you, Mario.
Okay, thank you very much, Darren. And thank you for inviting me. This is my first in-person event that I am attending since the previous era. Remember, for the pandemic? It was a long time ago. So I'm quite excited. I'm very happy to be here in person. It's funny because, you know, people who, like the previous presentation, David was in Singapore. I mean, in a way, he was in person as well. Like he was him speaking. But, you know, we're used to this kind of language. And actually, his presentation, David's presentation, has given me an idea, or has reminded me of a really important aspect of what I'm going to talk about today. So what I might do, depending on how we're doing with time, I'll introduce an extra bit of discussion. So decolonizing Englishes, I put that, you know, Englishes in brackets, the plural. You know, it's still, it's kind of debatable really what we mean by the pluralization of English, but that's less important. But the decolonizing word is more important. Subtitle: Which statues must fall? So in a way, what I'll be talking about is what kind of principles, what kind of ideas do we need to reconsider and revise, perhaps change about English, especially English as a global language. So first of all, a little bit of, you know, reflection on what we mean by decolonization. And sorry, I've got this habit of walking left and right during a presentation. Tell me if this is getting annoying, and I'll stop. No, seriously, I'm serious about that. My students complain all the time, you know, they get seasick. What does the prefix "d" mean in decolonization? I think that's a really important question. One interpretation and one hears very often is that to decolonize means to remove the colonial, to remove something, to remove a bit of history, right? Especially the critics of those who don't quite agree with the whole concept of decolonization criticize the idea by saying, well, you know, you can't erase history, you can't change history. If you remember a couple of years ago, the toppling of the statue of Colston in Bristol. Colston was a slave trader, and during the Black Lives Matter movement, this was one symbolically important moment because it wasn't just the statue that was being toppled, but it was like, you know, what it represented, right? The meaning of it. And a lot of, you know, as you remember, a lot of people were there was a big debate, right? A lot of people were saying, you know, what's the point of doing that? It's actually wrong. And this is one comment: you cannot escape history, and it would be fundamentally dishonest of us through removing statues and airbrushing our history to pretend that all was well. You know, that was kind of the criticism. You know, we can't just get rid of a statue and therefore remove a segment of history. This is Prime Minister, I'm afraid. He said, we cannot now try to edit or censor our past. We cannot pretend to have a different history. The statues in our cities and towns were put up by previous generations. So, you know, we have no right to get rid of them. The idea of editing or censoring our past is kind of powerful in a way, because it's like saying, you know, you can't pretend, right? We can't pretend to be different from what we are. This was Tristram Hunt, the curator of the Victorian Albert Museum. He was a Labour MP at one point, I think. I'm not going to play the video because I'm just saying that. And, you know, a frame which says you have to decolonize this institution, talking about the museum, doesn't understand that the history of it is totally embedded in the colonial story and the colonial experience. I think this is really interesting. This is really illustrative of this particular point of view, right? You can't decolonize because the history of the museum is totally embedded in the colonial story. So it doesn't make sense to decolonize, according to this perspective, right?
So the origins of the V&A are embedded in the British imperial and colonial story. And this is why I think to decolonize the V&A in many ways doesn't make sense, because you can't. That the colonial story is embedded within the entirety of the museum. And in a sense, you decontextualize that story. And it's not a...
Okay, so that's the, right, that's the principle. And this is, I mean, in some way, not in exactly the same way, but I decided to include this as well, which is a very different point of view. I mean, you know, Satnam Sangara has written this really, really good book on Ireland. But he says at one point in this interview, trying to take out empire is like trying to take out, you know, the eggs from a baked cake. So this again, this idea is repeated on this idea of, you know, removing something, you can't do it.
I feel like...
Okay. Right. So I'm questioning that. So does decolonization mean removing the colonial, right? As the people are saying, suggesting. First of all, you know, we have to understand what history is. You know, when we talk about erasing history, history isn't simply some sort of a sequence, a factual sequence of events, and we say, you know, we remove one bit of it, and so we are, you know, doing a disservice to history. History is our interpretation of the past, right? And our interpretation of the past is always somehow connected to the interests of the present, right? We interpret the past according to what we want to say now, according to how we understand the present, and crucially, according to how we want to represent the present. So history is about the present, very much so, right? So we know, you know, it's not that we are erasing a bit of the past when we say decolonize. But more fundamentally,
there is also
sorry about the bits of videos, because I'm, you know, very aware of the time. So we're not attempting to remove segments of history. That doesn't make sense, right? But we are doing something which is the exact opposite to that, right? Decolonizing means engaging with the colonial history seriously, right? Recognizing actually that a lot of the present is so deeply embedded in the colonial history, and dealing with that and engaging with that seriously. So it's exactly the opposite of what the critics of decolonization suggest. You know, it's not removing, but it's actually engaging with colonial history, understanding how it determines many aspects of the present, and changing practices accordingly. So it's not just, okay, you know, this has some colonial root, colonial origin. Okay, we're aware of that, but then what do we do about it, right? So changing practices, changing ideas, changing worldviews, changing the way we understand the world. So the English language, I think we can do something with the English language as well. English language is deeply embedded in colonial history, especially when we talk about English as a global language. It's completely embedded in colonial history. So should it be decolonized, and how? So I'm not going to give you a recipe, right, for how to decolonize English. Yeah, this is a bit misleading. The how, you know, this is not the how to. It's basically some reflections on some metaphorical statues that I think need to fall, or at least, kind of be destabilized. One of that is actually a statute I haven't included in this presentation, but I want to talk about as well, because David's presentation earlier has reminded me about. Let's see if I can include it somehow. First of all, discourses about English as a global language are still very much entrenched in a colonial view of the world. When we talk about English as a global language, very, very often you can feel the coloniality in the words. I'm just going to give you some examples of that. This is Gordon Brown. This back in 2008, he was talking about the English language and the greatness of the English language around the world, and how it would benefit Britain as well, it would benefit the whole world. Behind that bar, it says the English language, like football and other sports, began here, meaning in Britain, and has spread to every corner of the globe. I've highlighted in bold bits that are particularly significant to me. English is much more than a language. It's a bridge across borders and cultures, a source of unity in a rapidly changing world. All these metaphors, very kind of positive metaphors. For Britain, this is not a matter of narrow national pride. It is part of an accident of history, really interesting word, some kind of accident, a wave of knowledge and commerce that gave the world the English language. Brilliant, fantastic. This should be right. And I want Britain to make a new gift to the world, pledging to help and support anyone, whatever the circumstances, to have access to tools that need to. Now, you read this or you hear this as well, and comments come to your head immediately, right? So we don't have to spend a lot of time discussing this. But what's interesting is also Gordon Brown is not some kind of ultra-conservative imperial sort of right-wing nutter. And what this suggests to me is that these ideas and these metaphors, etc., are really deeply ingrained in discourses about English. We're kind of used to talking about English in the world this way. I'm saying we, in some kind of generic way. But even linguists, this David Crystal, in his super famous English as a global language, everybody has read. He said many times in that book, 2 or 3 times the same sentence, a language which has repeatedly found itself in the right place at the right time. This is a little bit similar to that accident idea, right? So that the English language somehow found itself almost like by itself, the English language is a traveler, another metaphor that somehow found itself in the right place at the right time. Huge amount of erasure. But also, I've chosen these quotes just to kind of illustrate how pervasive the idea that the English language is the thing that does things, that moves around, that spreads, that goes places, or does things. English changes lives, British Council. This is from a publication called The English Effect by the British Council. Even like famous sociolinguists have been, like Raj Katra, nobody bigger than him in World Englishes, the impact of English on languages across cultures. What I'm highlighting here is the English language put in the role of agent. It's the English language that does things. The very different routes along which English has expanded in different countries. This is Philipson. Now, Philipson, as you know, is one of the harshest critics of English as a global language. An article in The Guardian a few years ago, the English language is taking over the planet. Now, again, it's the English language is doing these things. right? Either the English language is, sort of travels, spreads. The spread of English is a very, very common metaphor. The spread of English, again, suggests that the English language spread can by itself, almost, right? So the primacy of language, the agency attributed to the English language, and therefore not attributed to people. So one statue that I think we must sort of, try and topple a bit is this idea of the spread of English. The English language didn't begin anywhere, didn't go anywhere, it's not spread anywhere. I think we need to kind of begin to get rid of these ideas. The English language didn't do anything and does nothing, right? And it's people that perform actions and not languages. And this may sound like a really basic or even banal thing, but it's not, right? We need to begin to change our language, I think. We need to put the English language less in the subject position and more somewhere else, In the subject position, we need to begin to put people, right? Because people perform actions, not languages. And when we say the English language is taking over the world, the English language is doing this and doing that, it means you're erasing actual agency. I'm going to go a little bit quicker. So the fact, sounds a little bit grim, but we mustn't forget that the fact that people speak English in Singapore, Hong Kong, Lagos, New Delhi, etc., is actually historically a direct result of empire, and hence a genocide, slavery, land grabbing, looting, exploitation, imposition of power, and so on and so forth. This mustn't be forgotten, not because we have to have a morbid fascination with these things, but because this is what happened, right? And the English language is not just, as a global language, doesn't simply have historical roots in this, but it's currently, at the moment as we speak, entangled with huge issues of inequality, right, around the world. So the whole idea that English is this kind of, panacea that, a sort of gift to the world and allows, or in fact facilitates equality and so on, it's very much a myth. Yeah, even in World Englishes, right? In World Englishes is pretty much my area. There's this illusion of the equality of Englishes. You go around the world, you describe Englishes, and you say, well, Singapore English, Malaysian English, Indian English, etc. They're all equal, right? And that's it. And then you solve the problem. Actually, in reality, this huge inequality among Englishes. There's a fantastic book that you probably have heard about by Ruani Tupas called Unequal Englishes. I think he did it in 2016. Which really deals with these issues really cogently. Yeah, so I've said this. I've said this already. The English language is totally entangled with really serious issues of essentially coloniality. Is the effects of empire. Right? Empire was there for centuries, and what we've got now is not the end of empire, but it's the continuing effects of empire, which we can call coloniality. I know I've got 5 minutes, probably less now, but you see, one thing I wanted to talk about, because I haven't got time to talk about this now. I wanted to connect with, thank you. I wanted to connect with David's paper earlier, okay, somehow. And he was showing us fantastic data about Singapore English, etc. And at one point, in one of the segments of data that he was showing us, there was somebody who was talking about her family, and she was saying she was using niece in the singular instead of the plural. And he said, no, I didn't quite understand at the beginning. I thought she had one niece, instead she had 3. So, that's a feature of Singapore English, this kind of absence of plural S, right? Now, the reason why I want to talk about this very, very quickly is that this kind of study that we've engaged with for decades now, looking at features of this English and this other English and so on, tends to be based on this constant comparison between local varieties of English and what we regard as standard English. And what we regard as standard English is British English, right? So you look at Singapore English and say, oh, look, they don't put the S for plural, something weird going on, right? There's a fantastic study, I'm going to end here, by Lubna Alphagos, or something very similar. I always get this name wrong, and I apologize. In Singapore, Singaporean herself, who basically studied Singaporean English more from an internal perspective, and looking at what's going on from a Singaporean English's perspective, so from a Singaporean English. And what she found was really, really interesting. So, for example, what we may regard as instability in the use of the S for plural or singular, that will sometimes use the S, sometimes they don't. What's going on? What she realized is that the rules governing the plural or the singular in Singapore English are actually different. They're different rules. And the rules are to do not with countable or uncountable, things like that, but the rules are to do with specified or generic. So when it's generic, no S, when it's specified, S, okay? And that's an internal rule in Singaporean English. It's not a feature, it's not something that deviates from some kind of norm. So now that in itself, to me, is an example of how we could study Englishes from a decolonial perspective, not always and perennially from the center looking at the rest of the world. Oh, this is what happens there, this is what happens there. But, you know, the other way around as well. But I'm going to end here. I had more slides, but never mind. Thank you very much. I don't know if you've got time for questions.
It's because I want time for questions, because I know everyone's dying to ask.
Okay.
So please
I
do.
think I saw Kingsley there,
Yeah,
putting his hand up.
yeah, thank you so much, Mario. This is really great. Now, one thing that has really agitated me a lot is terms we use as linguists, as social linguists, word in this scholar. And one term which I really devoted attention to in my PhD was the native speaker. And
I've got slides about that.
yeah, I was thinking more about this because I mean, I remember the Edinburgh scholar who wrote about the death of the native speaker a long time ago, and I was wondering, did the native speaker ever die, or has he resurrected after 3 days or so of death? Right. So, but these terms come with a lot of meaning. I was expecting, I wanted to talk more about the terms we use as maybe perhaps one of the statues that must fall as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Totally agree, 100% agree. And I wasn't joking, I've got a couple of slides on exactly that point. I think the terminology that we use is essential to this process of decolonization. And native speaker, non-native speaker, these are terms that must go away. We must not use them. As simple as that, we must not use these terms. Simply because they're totally charged with coloniality, right? Because as you know, native speaker means white European, full stop. It doesn't mean anything else, okay? And therefore that's colonial, and it's racist as well. Non-native speaker means non already. It's a negative particle that defines people by what they are not, okay? So native and non-native speakers are words that I would say we must stop using and not replacing them with alternatives, because then we're doing the same thing. We're not saying, oh, let's not use native speaker, use something else, and let's not use non-native speaker and use something else, because you're replacing one term with another, and then you do the same thing. It's just the concept that must be got rid of, right? So there are other distinctions that could be, that are more valuable. Someone is a monolingual speaker of English, someone is a multilingual speaker of English, for example. Or, you know, or use terms that are more factually accurate for what we want to say. Let's say white person, European, if that's what we mean, instead of using native speaker. So yeah, that's you know, it's a set of terms that yeah, you should have it.
And one thing, just one more thing.
One very short thing, because there's lots of other
Okay,
questions.
all right, that's fine. Okay, yeah. This issue of we're talking about equalizing, of course, I've read 2 parts, and this equality is a myth. Then also when it comes to publishing, right, and publishers will still require you to write in spelling, in grammar, in everything according to British English and according to American English. And surprisingly, by the same journals who propagates this pluralistic sense of English. So how does one, as a early career researcher, battle with that kind of irony?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is something that we could easily add to the slide presentation. You know, this idea that journals still require some of the journal guidelines. I don't know if we've changed them, but some of the journals that they explicitly say, going back to your previous point, if you're a non-native speaker of English, please ensure that your draft is read by a native speaker of English. So how does one? Yeah, I mean, we have to keep fighting. I mean, we have that problem that you illustrated is part of this. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
So I saw a hand up here.
Answered my.
You're going to say,
Yeah.
okay. So
I'll give
of
it
you
to
two, who wins the fight?
You feel free.
Yeah, she was dying to say something in the last thing as well, and I had to cut her off. So go on, Aruba.
Right.
Hi, my name is Aruba. I graduated at Newcastle, currently work at Lancaster. I think it's an observation, but also a question. We know obviously that there's a lot of racism surrounding English, and this comes from kind of like a recent event in my life. My husband is doing his English test for the citizenship, and a lot of the videos on YouTube that he's looking at, like, you know, people from Hong Kong, people from India, people from Nigeria, you know, why do they have to do this? If these are low English, like why are those Englishes not acknowledged? And what are we doing as researchers beyond talking about all of this in a sort of like echo chamber? We all agree with each other. But where's the impact on policy? What are we doing to translate what we agree upon into actual policy, government policy, visa applications, so on and so forth? Because that's obviously like what qualifies a native speaker. Besides the expanding circles and the inner circles and so on.
I think that's a super good point. It's the whole point about impact and research, right? You know, we've been saying these things to one another and kind of applauding. Yeah, great.
We're right on.
Yeah, agree. But then where is the change in society, in policy, etc.? That's true. I mean, that's the whole value of the importance of impact that we have realized relatively recently. I will say, however, that things are changing. One almost surprising place where you've seen changes is in the Common European Framework for Languages. In the latest revision of it, which was a few years ago. It's quite significant, and it's kind of going in the right direction. So things are changing slowly or whatever, but something is happening. But you're absolutely right. We do, as scholars and sociolinguists, basic researchers, we need to engage with the outside world a lot more. Yes, yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah,
Kate, if you could make it.
Okay, yeah, because my question kind of is in a similar vein in a way. Because I mean, I guess I was kind of broadly thinking about the kind of distinction between like whether we're thinking about kind of how we look at it and how we can understand language better as sociolinguists, or whether there's something to be said about the importance of kind of digging into how people at large understand it. And I'm thinking particularly about, you were talking about how the English language did nothing and does nothing. And I totally take your point that, it's people who, for example, did the colonial thing. But I mean, when I'm thinking about something like the idea that, speaking English will give somebody access to wealth, which is something that I work on. There are other ideas too, right? That you can think better in English is one of them, which has currently ridiculously enough. But I say that, I wonder if we do move away from, or if we kind of start to just kind of say that, you know, languages don't do things, people do things, like I say, which I agree with to an extent. Do we kind of risk losing sight of how people actually think languages work, and is that kind of another important aspect to deal with in kind of decolonial?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I understand your question, Kate. I think what we need to do is, I think in that slide where I said language does nothing, etc., I was almost purposely being a little bit radical about it. Okay, I think what we need to do is to challenge the primacy of language. You know? Almost being a bit humble. I mean, we're sociolinguists and we think that language is like the main thing in our world, right? But actually, we should question that as well. How important is language in, and also it's not important, okay? But how important is language, or let me put it slightly differently. Is language in people's lives as important as we think it is? As important as almost like, because we are used to thinking of languages, the main thing that we are worrying about. And that's why I think part of the reason why we keep saying language does this and language does that is because for us, language is everything, right? But, and then we kind of lose sight of the fact that language is actually deeply embedded in everything, but it's not necessarily the agent. And so we need to recalibrate, I think, to put it a little bit more nuanced than that slide was suggesting, recalibrate the role of language in society. Not to say it doesn't count or whatever, but to give it a different place and to realize that it doesn't always have to be at the top of everything. Maybe I don't know if that answers your question, Kate, but
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's
yeah.
really interesting. I know. I can tell that I'm supposed to be quiet now.
So we're going to get coffee, whether it's the last thing I do or not. We're going to be here and get coffee. But listen, what a thought-provoking talk.
thank you.
Really radical, which is what we like, is it not?
Please.
And we look forward to more chat over coffee,
Sure.
over lunch, and later on today.
Great. Thank you very much.